Hello and welcome to the 19th annual Brattleboro Literary Festival. It's our first virtual festival and we're so excited that you could join us. We are actually the very last event, the capping off event for the festival this weekend. It's been wonderful so far. And if you're just joining us, be sure to go to our website, brattleboro.org, where you can read all about the authors who've read this weekend, learn more about them. You can make a donation and you can find their books, their bios, and learn more about the history of the festival. Next year is our 20th anniversary. It's the longest running literary festival in New England. So we're thrilled to be here with you virtually today. And I'm Diana Whitney, coming to you live from Brattleboro, Vermont. And I'm here today with Chard deNiord, former Vermont Poet Laureate. We're the co-hosts of this event. And I guess, like I said, the very last event of the festival, and we are so thrilled to have 5 extraordinary poets here with us. They have each written poems that bear witness to injustice, poems that light up the imagination and sing of the wonder and pain of being human in our present moment. This afternoon, they're going to read from their new books, and then we'll talk about the intersection of poetry and social justice. So because it's Zoom, here's how it's going to happen. First, each of the poets will read one poem, and they'll be introduced by either me or Chard. And then we will start our discussion. And finally, we'll open it up for audience Q&A. And we really want to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining. And please just write your questions in the chat if you have questions for the poets, and we'll hope to address them. So as we start the reading, in solidarity with all the kids in Zoom school every day, we're going to go alphabetically, starting with Cameron Awkward-Rich. Cameron Awkward-Rich is the author of Sympathetic Little Monster, which was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award. He is a Cave Canem Fellow, a poetry editor for Muzzle Magazine, and a critic who earned his PhD from Stanford University's program in Modern Thought and Literature. He is an assistant professor of women, gender, sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and is currently working on a book about maladjustment in trans literature and theory. Cameron's mesmerizing award-winning collection of poetry, Dispatch, was published in 2019 by Persia Books. The poems in Dispatch are urgent and lyrical, profoundly intimate, exploring how to live and love in the shadow of violence against Black, queer, and trans bodies. Both his elegies and his love poems claim the possibility of transformation. Thank you so much, Cameron, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. What a luminous crowd to be among. I'm just going to read one poem, which I won't say much about, but I will say that it is both an elegy and a love poem. I wrote it the day after the Pulse shooting in 2016. And the sort of news conversation about that event was deeply troubling to me. And so I wrote this poem, which is a kind of revision of a Richard Siken poem. All my friends are sad and bright. I think door, and there is. Open, and here's a room where everything you've lost is washed ashore. We've seen the news, we know the story, how even our bodies hurt us sometimes so much. Room of broken mirrors, room of salt, room of marigolds, and it's your party, baby. Here's a crown, here's a gown, and no man just around the corner, all your eyes on you. I think gunflower, and here's a field. Here's a room where every bullet planted blooms. Boy with flower, boy with metal rose. What's done is done. What fire affords you. I was a child once. Anything could be my kingdom. All I had to do was say, here's a room of water and gold and nothing else. A room in which a man takes back his blood. Goodbye, blood. Goodbye, stars. Goodbye, dead light troubling the dance your body does all by itself. I was by myself once, beside myself, breath fogging up a window and what's on the other side. Only everything you wanted. And here's a room of everything you wanted. Think peppermint and myrrh. Think loved, and you don't even have to die. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna hold up Cameron's book. I'll do it again, but it's an amazing book. So next we have Natalie Diaz. Sorry, I have to get myself organized. Natalie Diaz is the author of the award-winning poetry collection, When My Brother Was an Aztec, and a groundbreaking new book, Post-Colonial Love Poem. She is Mojave and an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian tribe, and she teaches at the Arizona State University Creative Writing MFA program. Among many honors, Natalie has been awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship for her work. Post-Colonial Love Poem is a finalist for the National Book Award and has been shortlisted for both the Forward Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prize. These poems sing of desire in the body, awakening a connection to the earth, to ancestors, water, and land. Her language embodies stories and histories, queer love and environmental destruction, revealing the myths and erasures of American colonialism while affirming the power of desire and dreams. Thank you so much, Natalie, for joining us today.
Gracias for having me. It's my luck to be with all of you. I haven't seen Carolyn in a little while. Elizabeth, it's my joy, Chard, to be with you all. And Major, it's always lucky to see you. And Cameron, to see you here. Your work has been so important to me and my students, so it's really lucky. I'm coming to you all from one of my homelands, Acamel, Atam, and Peeposh land. So I'm in Phoenix right now, but it's lucky to join you there, and some of you at least are in Abenaki land. So post-colonial love poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snake bite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started before those millennia ago and onward, those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever blooming wounds. I was built by wage, so I wage love and worse. Always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flash of your pale skin, settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pool of all my thirsts. I learned drink in a country of drought. We pleasure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon polished by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel turning green, mottled red, the jaspers of our desires. There are wildflowers in my desert which take up to 20 years to bloom. The seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, lifting them in its copper current, opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life. Where your hands have been are diamonds down my shoulders, back, thighs. I am your culebra. I am in the dirt for you. Your hips are quartz light and dangerous, two rose-horn rams ascending a soft desert wash before the November sky untethers a 100-year flood. The desert returns suddenly to its ancient sea. Arise the wild heliotrope, scorpion weed, blue phacelia, which hold purple the way a throat can hold the shape of any great hand. Great hands is what she called mine. The rain will eventually come or not. Until then, we touch our bodies like wounds. The war never ended and somehow begins again. Gracias.
Thank you, Natalie. So I'm introducing Carolyn next, Diana? Correct. Yes, we are indeed in Abenaki country, Natalie, here in Vermont. Carolyn Forshay is a poet, editor, professor, translator, and human rights advocate. She's received many awards for both her poetry and work as a humanitarian, including the Yale Younger Poets Prize, the Alice Faye D. Castagnola Award, the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the Edita and Ira Morris Award, the Hiroshima Foundation Award for Peace and Culture. She's the director of the Lannan, or she was the director of the Lannan Center, recently stepped down from that for poetics and social practice, and held the Lannan Visiting Chair in Poetry at Georgetown University, where she's now a university professor. She is co-chair with Gloria Steinem of the Creative Advisory Council of Hedgebrook. In October 2019, she, What You Have Heard Is True was published. This book here I recommend very highly, and hope all of you will find a chance to read it. It's a memoir about her time in El Salvador in 1979 and 1980 during the Salvadoran Civil War. Was named a finalist for the National Book Award and won the 2019 Juan Mendez Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America. In addition to publishing 5 books of poetry, most recently in The Lateness of the World, Carolyn has edited 2 groundbreaking poetry anthologies, Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness, and The Poetry of Witness. I just want to read one quick comment about her new book by Joyce Carol Oates. Carolyn Forché, like Neruda, Philip Levine, Denise Levertov, and others who have in recent years wed the political and the personal, addresses herself unflinchingly to the exterior historical world. She is a poet of uncommon vigor and assurance. Carolyn.
Thank you, Shal, for that lovely introduction. It's nice to meet you, Diana, and you, Elizabeth, and Cameron, and to see Major and Natalie and Shal again. It's an honor and a pleasure and a joy to be in your company. I will read one poem from the new book. It has a bird on the cover, but this poem was given to me by a refugee from Homs, Syria, on the condition that someday in some form I would write about it to pass it on to others, because the man who gave it to me did not feel he could write. I tried to talk him into doing it himself, but he said no, it was impossible. It's called The Boatman. We were 31 souls, he said, in the gray sick of sea, in a cold rubber boat, rising and falling in our filth. By morning, this didn't matter. No land was in sight. All were soaked to the bone, living and dead. We could still float, we said, from war to war. What lay behind us but ruins of stone, piled on ruins of stone? City called Mother of the Poor, surrounded by fields of cotton and millet. City of jewelers and cloak makers, with the oldest church in Christendom and the sword of Allah. If anyone remains there now, they would be utterly alone. There is a hotel named for it in Rome, 200 meters from the Piazza di Spagna, where you can have breakfast under the portraits of film stars. There, the staff cannot do enough for you. but I am talking nonsense again, as I have since that night. We fetched a child, not ours, from the sea, drifting face down in a life vest, its eyes taken by fish or the birds above us. After that, Aleppo went up in smoke, and Raqqa came under a rain of leaflets warning everyone to go. Leave, yes, but go where? We lived through the Americans and Russians, through Americans again. Many nights of death from the clouds, mornings surprised to be waking from the sleep of death, still unburied and alive, with no safe place. Leave, yes, we'll obey the leaflets, but go where? To the sea, to be eaten? To the shores of Europe, to be caged? To camp misery and camp remain here? I ask you then, where? You tell me you are a poet. If so, our destination is the same. I find myself now the boatman, driving a taxi at the end of the world. I will see that you arrive safely, my friend. I will get you there.
Thank you, Carolyn. Very powerful. Our next guest is Major Jackson. Hello, Major. Major is the author of 5 books of poetry, including The Absurd Man, Roll Deep Holding Company, Hoops, and Leaving Saturn, which won the Cave Canem Poetry Prize for her first book of poems. His edited volumes include Best American Poetry 2019, Renega for Obama, the Library of America, County Cullen, Collected Poems. Major Jackson is a recipient of the fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, and a National Endowment for the Arts grant. Major lives in Burlington, Vermont, where he is the Richard A. Dennis Professor of English and University Distinguished Professor at the University of Vermont. He serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. I would just like to, before you read, Major, to read a quick quote that that's from an interview I did with you about a year ago. You wrote, or you said, "There's a responsibility attendant with being a writer, one whose voice is heard above others. Because of the enormous platform, it's almost an imperative to address the moral and ethical questions of one's time." Michael Harper says in an interview, "We have to enter into a continuum of consciousness." And that phrase, that entering into a continuum, is what I realize my work has sought to accomplish all along. End of quote. And I would just like to add, I think it has. Major.
Thank you, Chard. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Brattleboro Literary Festival. Always a pleasure to be with beloved friends, and every time I see them in this forum, I realize how poignant my loss and how deep I miss you, Natalie and Liz, Carolyn, and Cameron. Your work has been quite meaningful to me as well. Our eyes were far away. It's a poem about waking up to certain political realities as a writer and what happens after that. Our eyes were far away. Our eyes were far away, as were the hills writing their own memoirs, marking our stark absence, our blue-faced emptiness. We believed what we felt then, till our doctrines signaled nothing. Naked, we woke to our islands, and dressed having canceled the tour. In the corner, there was a mirror, but the prophets were there sequestered, withdrawn. And our sculptures revealed remote testimonies. Who revolted as fresh hatreds swept across our faces while we slept? We walked past the coffin of what we once were, the dead awakened, no longer safe in our siestas. We thought we said everything. We hadn't. Bloodstained, we now raise a bandaged hand and pen. Where we want to go has no name.
Thank you, Major. Just want to hold up a copy of your new book here, The Absurd Man, with this really beguiling cover on it. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that when we begin our discussion, Major. Thank you so much for such wonderful work. Our last poet, but certainly not least, is Elizabeth Powell, better known as Liz Powell. She's the author of 3 books of poems, including Atomizer. You really have to see this cover also. I'd love to hear about the concept of this cover, the creation of it as well. It's a picture of an atomizer with 2 legs sticking out of the back. Published by LSU. Her second book of poems, Willie Loman's Reckless Daughter, Living Truthfully Under Imaginary Circumstances, was named a book we love in 2016 by the New Yorker, and I think Major had something to do with that. Her novel concerning the Holy Ghost's interpretation of J. Crew catalogs was published in 2019 in the United Kingdom. She's the editor of Green Mountains Review and professor of creative writing at Northern Vermont University. Liz.
Thank you, Chard. It's wonderful to be here with all you beautiful poets and people, and hi, Brattleboro. Thank you for having me, Diana and Chard. I appreciate it. I'm going to read a poem from Atomizer called Shulamite. The Shulamite comes from, well, she was the favorite wife of King Solomon, and she's referred to many times in the Song of Songs. And this is part of my discussion with my ancestors, but also a discussion of how maybe my ancestors loved was so different than how we love in the modern age, and that disruption of our humanness that comes through technology and other things, hatred and so forth. So it's called Shulamite. One day I stopped the swipe, left or right. One day I started to believe, like the Shulamite, the ashen-haired ancestor, that I am my beloved's, and his desire is toward me, whether I ask for it or not, because that's what faith is, because that's what Shulamite means, O daughters of Zion. The time for singing has come. His name's perfume, and it pours out of my name. This truth procedure is a composition that is not of the forefinger and a screen and a selfie stick. A society of love cannot be proven in 3 sporty photos, a yoga pose, a bike ride in Vermont, a car selfie. The more I swiped, the more love eluded me. Come away from your computing, children. Truth is the oar in the water, the hand gripping. Belief is the bird call of saints. For the screen does not blossom forth frankincense or liquid myrrh. Many are sad because of their screens. So I will sing to my beloved of how I was delivered from the dynamite of the tinder, the flame of the false desires, marketed kisses, the sighting, the sending off, a match that cannot ignite my life. to blast to the core of coquetry's online presences. How I still wear scent as homecoming, an aldehyde, Chanel number 5. His song forms time and his breath smells of apples and calamus. I adjured him, turn your eyes away from me. They overwhelm me. Do not stir up love until it is ready. So my beloved gathers his myrrh with my spice, his Patu pour homme with my Chanel cristal, his Dior Fahrenheit with my Bal à Versailles girlhood, civet laced and dark in a Parisian bottle of my stepmother. O daughters of Zion, the gazelles and does rise to the summit during the harvest moon. Unsubscribe to dating sites scribed by people who don't believe. For even the moldering hay knows it is sung in the wind, not to awaken love until it is ready. For did not my people die of the wages of love? Yes, my people died of the wages of love. Yet here I am. Did they not traverse the desert too? Yes, and did they not thirst? Yes, they did not thirst. For beloved, you are the scent between my breasts. I will no longer trust the vagary of electronic nothing, for I am of the Shulamite's line. Her adder of mandrake rises in me like testimony, like law. I lay it at the altar of he comes without doubt, without swipe, right, without type, without facial recognition, without thumbprint. For I am my beloved's and his desire is for me, and it gives forth fragrance, his myrrh and my spice. Who writes, who conjures? My beloved contains all of Solomon's songs and fills the hidden scroll inside me. I write the first part of the sentence, he completes it, all his sense sees me, and there is nothing more to believe, but, O daughters of Zion, his eyes do not turn away. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Wonderful readings, all of you. So now it's about 5 o'clock and we can begin our discussion. Maybe the best way to start would be to ask you folks, our guest poets, if you have any questions for each other. And then we have, Diana and I both have some questions prepared, but you've all just heard your poems, and I'm curious to know if you have any questions for each other, maybe to start off.
And I just want to say one thing, which is that I'm hoping we're going to get to switch to gallery view. I don't know if anyone else is on speaker view, but it'd be really nice to have all of us up for the discussion. So if the host of the event can hear me, if you can switch us, please, we would love that. And yeah, if somebody wants to ask a question of another poet, go ahead, and thank you all for those just beautiful, oh, you've switched, okay, great. It's not switched on mine, but thank you. So yeah, go ahead if you would like to pose a question, or Chard will start off with one of our questions.
Anybody have a question? Well, let's see. Natalie, you mind if I begin with you?
I'm
Can you
ready.
hear me okay?
Yeah, I've gotten to this awful thumbs up mode from my students, and I
Okay.
shudder every time I do it.
Sorry, I didn't see your thumb.
I'm starting to do it all over my life.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So you did a wonderful interview for The Guardian, a newspaper, last summer. And in this interview, you said, in Mojave, our words for want and need are the same. Because why would you want what you don't need? For me, that's true desire. Desire isn't frivolous. It's what life is. And then you actually go on to say this as well. Can we create these intimate spaces within the very nation that doesn't want us? Is it possible? Can I really imagine beyond a nation from within a nation? I don't know if I'll ever get out of the labyrinth that is this nation. Will any of us? So I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about how poetry specifically serves as a liberating literary vehicle for effecting justice, for acting as an intellectual, spiritual, and affective catalyst for transcending prejudice, discrimination, and persecution with language that defines common human denominators with transpersonal speakers who express a universal language for which the dominant culture has very little or no vocabulary, whose most profound expression is always subversive and ironic.
First of all, Chard, I think you must be Mojave, because I thought I was the only one who asked questions like that. But
Well, that's
that's a 4-day question. But I'm with you. Again, gracias, Diana and Chard both, and for the generosity of the question. I think I've been sitting here spinning the last line major of the poem you read, and I'm familiar with that work. I've spent some time with it. But thinking that the last line, where we want to go has no name. And to me, that's very related to the ways that I think about poetry and also desire. I think sometimes, and of course, this is one of the perspectives. I reserve always the right to change my mind in 2 minutes. But for me, poetry is the desire and energy toward an action. I don't necessarily consider my poetry to be my action, but it is one way I consider how I have acted and how I might act. And so I keep thinking about where we want to go has no name. And in Mojave, we never name a thing after a person. A thing is named for what has happened there. And I'm also thinking, I've been in conversation with some of my friends who are working. I'm thinking also of like the hush harbor and like the ways we talk about how to move, the ways we talk about momentum. And that's one of the ways poetry has like started to mean to me, is that it's a momentum and an energy. It's not the body, but it's an estimation of the body, an estimation of where the body has been or how I'm experiencing what it has done and how it has not yet arrived at some of those places. And it's not an easy thing to hold right now, I think, in this world when I'm trying to ask, what am I doing? I try really hard not to ask what it means. Like I try hard not to ask what anything I do means. But I'm trying, and it's not easy because I don't think the English language is built this way. It's not built for certain momentums. And so I don't think that a poem is a pinning down. And I don't think a name is a pinning down. Like for me to hear my name called, and this is why I keep going back, Major, to that last line, like to hear my name called is one, everywhere I've been and done everything I've done, and also what I might answer to or where I might arrive having been called. And so that's not necessarily an exact answer to the question, Chard, but it's, for me, I'm kind of disallowing the answer. Like for me, poetry has to be a momentum or a pathway. And I don't know that I'll ever arrive on the other side of it. And somehow I'm trying to reorganize what it means to be in that tension. And there's a way that I feel very lucky to be among the works of all of you here, because that's what I find there. I find myself in that tension of not having arrived yet. And that feels lucky to me. So that's maybe where I'll fade
That's
away.
really uplifting, Natalie. Thank you. It might be good to segue to Major in response to this. Major has written this new book, which is very different from your past books, Major, The Absurd Man. It's such a wonderful leap. I think it was, well, one of your comments on the back said that you've created a new genre almost of your own here. But I'm wondering, I'm wondering about the absurd man in your work. You're obviously heavily influenced by the myth of Sisyphus by Camus, and just the idea of authenticity in the individual and finding answers for yourself outside of the mainstream culture, outside of culture in general, is such a radical notion of, and it must be a very lonely one in many ways, of finding new meaning without the buttresses and supports of tradition, of culture. So I'm wondering, in light especially of the work you've already written that addresses culture so powerfully and memorably, how this leap that you've taken into the absurd and the idea of the absurd man occurred to you initially, and how you feel now about having written a whole book about this idea, this existential idea of finding new meaning in a very bold and stridently different way from your earlier work.
I'm gonna see if I can connect to the theme of the hour as well, and maybe riff a little off of what Natalie just said.
Yeah.
I think part and parcel, some of us who are engaged in this work realize that poetry is one of the means by which we not only transform ourselves, but with great faith that also leads to the transformation of society. And that is that is an awareness that one arrives at, I think, after some years writing. I think most people who come to poetry find themselves kind of marked by their lives and experiences, and it becomes one of self-care and caretaking. And then at some point, one wakes up. I'm going back to that poem that I just wrote, or that I just read. One wakes up and realizes that part of the wounds and scars that we wear as individuals is owed to something larger that is in our, that is systemic, that is societal, that is in how we treat each other and treat the earth. And then poetry starts taking on a kind of a more urgent taking. I'm thinking about the poems that have been dear to me, in which I realize that it's both an inward looking and outward looking. I love this line in Carolyn's poem, "You tell me you are a poet, if so our destination is the same." And it ends, "I will see that you arrive safely." That takes an enormous amount of belief and faith in the symbolic act of writing, very private activity that we do. Regards previous works, I want to say that I don't, so to answer your question directly, Camus has been a very important writer for me since high school. And the myth of Sisyphus which questions the act and meaning of suicide, I returned to because my wife Dee experienced suicide, and I wanted to return to a book that was kind of foundational for me and see what it had to say. And it's just really, it was really phenomenal for me to kind of think about the agency in acknowledging the split self, particularly as a writer. So I'm gonna stop there and just say, for me, it's an interrogation of both the self, but also how that can lead to a transformation of the world around us.
Thank you, Major.
Thank you. I'm gonna jump in with a question. Such great answers so far. I'm just going to widen the lens really wide right now and ask, what is the role of poetry in our age of crisis? And how does poetry wake people up to issues of social justice? And I guess I also want to reflect on Cameron's poem written after the Pulse nightclub tragedy, and I guess what it means. So maybe Cameron, maybe you could start what it means for us to read that poem as opposed to, say, a news story or a social media post about that tragedy, or about anything that we are currently bearing witness to. So how is poetry different, and what role does it play?
Sure. I mean, that is a huge question, which I will answer differently on any given day. I think about sort of that poem in particular, and many of the poems in the book in general that are sort of responding to, you know, the kind of feeling of being saturated with bad news of the 19th century, bad news of tomorrow, et cetera. I mean, I think that what I was trying to do in that poem, and what I think that poetry can do that is sort of written in response to events as they are mediated by other kinds of writing, is it can sort of give you a way of transforming that story, right? It gave me a way of imagining that the lives of the people who died in the nightclub might have become meaningful on a national scale in a way that like did not require their death, right? So what bothered me so much about that news story was that all of a sudden these sort of queer Latinx and Black people who at the sort of largest level of the media are more or less not sort of seen as like subjects of the nation, right? All of a sudden became kind of like mournable figures. And so I was trying to figure out how to write an elegy for them that did not require the spectacle of their death. And I think that this is something that poetry can do, right? Is we can ask the question of like, how do we take our sort of national genres and make them do different things? I mean, I guess I also think that I sort of not resist, but I sort of am wary of the kind of presumption, right? That, I mean, I think as Natalie was saying, and I think as Major was saying also, that poetry is itself an action. I've been sort of really trying to write this essay about Polly Murray, who was a civil rights activist, a poet, a lawyer, a priest, did all sorts of things and did all kinds of like tangible political actions, right? Staged counter sit-ins in 1940s, tried to like protested racial segregation in the 1940s, and it was just like an amazing figure, but also wrote poetry, and said this thing, which I think is really how I think about it, which was that like, when they found themselves in situations where they could not act, that is when they wrote poetry, right? It was a way of figuring out, right, like how to persist in moments of suspended agency, and to bear the tension of it. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that that's what poetry, for me at least, is for in crisis, is to say, okay, I don't know what or how to act, but maybe I can bear the tension of it.
That's very nicely put. Bear the tension of it, Cameron. That's really wonderful.
Yeah. Does anyone else, like Carolyn or Liz, want to and address that big question, or should we? That was a beautiful answer. Move on.
Is the question about how poetry affects the world?
So
That can be one of the questions, certainly, yes.
Well, the question was about social and political efficacy, I think, for poetry. And I think of poetry as radically subtle. It's like in chaos theory, you know, poetry goes out into the luminous Indra web and, you know, sends a kind of presence into the world, presence in language, and it can't be measured, it can't be traced. It's multivalent, it's multiple, it's so I'm very careful to sort of avoid making kind of a direct connection between poems or the intentions of poems and action that directly results in a movement of some kind. I think language generates meaning. It also archives it. And so poetry is an archive of encounters and attentions. Language is a life form, so it's always growing and mutating and transforming. And our language use, of course, reflects our consciousness. It can't be otherwise. So the path toward liberating language is always the path toward a greater or clearer awareness about oneself and others and oneself and the world. So for me, poetry's always been a refuge. It's the place where I go to go deep, you know, and to embody remembrance rather than recording memory. And when I read it aloud or when someone reads my work on the page, I hope that some poems achieve the bringing of sin to the eye so that moral conscience might be awakened even slightly. So I don't think of it as this, you know, jackhammer force. I think of it as something very almost evanescent. And I know that's not how people usually think about the relation between poetry and politics or political efficacy of the poem, but the poem comes from deep consciousness. And so I think right now the work poets are doing in the world, not only in this country, but all over the world and in parts of the world where they have far greater faith in it than we tend to have here, not the poets, but everyone else in the culture. There's a great work being done right now, which I think is transformative in a time of great and grave peril that we're all aware of. And not we're all aware of, but people here in the windows on the Zoom, I believe, are aware of. And that work is necessary, and that work is not something that we can know anything about really while we're doing it or once it leaves us.
Carolyn, in the interview I did with you, the last thing you said was that language written in the aftermath of extremity, like the extremity that Cameron just described, or it certainly could be an extremity war, as Larkin said, man handing on misery to man, bears the imprint of that experience, regardless of its content. Is that which is written out of that which was endured. In many respects, this is ineffable. The words come not from recollection in tranquility, but from wandering in a debris field.
Yeah, okay, yes, I remember that. I remember that answer. And we're now we are standing in the debris field now. Mm-hmm. And that mark of extremity, it marks our language as well as our memories and ourselves and our bodies. Mm-hmm. Extremity, we pass through it, so does our language. Mm-hmm. And it is an ineradicable mark. It's something that will show up in trace in our work. Mm-hmm. We can't, it's almost impossible to suppress. Mm-hmm. And so whether or not you directly address events explicitly, the trauma will always be in the language, mm. And regardless of subject matter.
Mm. I know you were deeply influenced by Terence DePrez, and he talks about the importance of the integrity of language, especially in his chapter about Phrenesius and Eros. And it goes back to what Wallace Stevens calls the nobility of language. Does that redound on anything you're saying here about language?
Well, it's a different discussion a little bit. I still argue with Terence, although he's been gone since 1987, because he would use the word human to be more human and to become human. And I didn't ever understand how he was using that word, because there are a lot of humans I would not want to become. I mean, I don't know what the direction is. I don't know whether that is but what he wanted was precision, was the integrity of precision in language and truth. I mean, it's a large word, but without falsifying anything, without distortion, without exaggeration, without over dramatization, something that is clear and respectful of whatever it's reproducing on the page, whatever it is making alive on the page.
Major, did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead, Natalie.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about this theme and not wanting to not wanting to dismiss what's been said, but I'm contemplating something that Diana asked, which was why go to poetry? And most of how we're receiving tragedies in the world is through social media feeds. Before it was nightly news. And even if it sparks rage, it still is distancing. There's still something about media that puts a certain kind of remove, and people are paralyzed by that, by whatever emotions that come up, rage or, and I find indifference can also be paralyzing. Lack of care. And just going back to Diana's question, do we believe that poetry brings it a little bit closer to us than the social media feed or the news feed? Isn't that part of what allows us, as Carolyn, you said, allows us to go deeper? It's one of the means by which we get closer to the tragedy of the lives that we're living, and hopefully to the joy, and hopefully close to desire. But I totally agree about language itself being scarred. That's part of the being paralyzed and being debilitated, is that we don't have the language, and folks are turning to us to help give some moment of clarity and understanding.
The collective, the language is being assaulted, the language of our collective and what's being reflected back to us in media. I know it's under assault. We have to maintain a very high degree of vigilance about that. And I think it's no coincidence that people have turned to poetry again, as they have in certain periods in the past. I sense there's Zooms with poetry readings all the time now. And I think there's a hunger, there's a desire there, as Natalie talked about desire.
I mean, something I'm thinking a lot about, though, is that I do think we're in a very dangerous, I mean, I like the word danger. I think danger is a good thing. I think tension is a good thing. I think those could those are like, I think creativity is a very smoothed out version of danger and tension because of control. But I do think we're in a dangerous place, because that return to poetry right now, to me, is borderline on symbolism again, and there's a way that symbolism can work backwards. Like every letter was once a body, and then of course, like when literacy happened, we moved away from this kind of oral tradition that, for me, the oral is, it's the nature of animacy, right? Like that I believe the natural condition of language is poetry. But as we moved away from that, then we had to begin to mark measures of poetry. Like the idea of nobility in language is very problematic to me, because what is nobility? And what is the hierarchical power structure of that? And so like something that I'm very interested in, and I mean these questions not in any kind of value judgment way, but in a way that language deserves pressure. There was a time when to say sun was very intentional. There was a time when to say you know, to say water, you know, we'll be at that time again soon. We're saying it is such a danger of life or death, you know. But I'm thinking a lot about literacy and about that extra layer that social media has placed on what is poetry, and where is the body in all that. And I don't mean that in a way that's saying one is bad, one is not good, but how are we relocating the energy of what began with literacy and typing? You know, poetry is not font. And now we're carrying these things and they're happening, you know, even with human. Like one of the troubles I have with human is I actually think human is not an animate word. I think it's an accumulative or a sum, and it's a very measured sum. So who gets to be it or not? And this, like this tension, like even this small conversation, this is such a short conversation, and where we are already at with just wondering about the capaciousness of a single word, or even, I think for me, more powerful, the collective of energy is, I think, what I'm most interested in, because the collective of energy is the collective of a living being, of living beings, of these energies that the language is just one small way of carrying. And so that is one of the places, like if I can even return to what is pre-literate, pre-language in a way, that's maybe where I always want to return to in terms of what we're capable of. And I'm not very articulate with it because it feels like just faded edges to me, but some of where you all are leading me is a very generous pathway that I want to kind of just now sit with. But yeah, those are just some of my wonders about it.
Yeah, I think that the intersection maybe between physics and spirituality can point us in the direction of how our language as it comes from our body can change atoms, can change energetic fields. And the more that we go away from the poem as language from the body as a human organism, it can become problematic. You know, poetry as ritual and sound as emotional gesture has the power of prayer in some ways. You know, like I am fascinated and a believer in this idea of process theology, that we are co-creators with God or the Great Spirit or whatever you want to call it. And through co-creation is how we get there, because right, all life is suffering. So what are our approaches to that suffering? And you know, there's an idea in the Jewish religion of tikkun, you know, this idea that we have a moral imperative to repair the world. And you know, and in the Buddhist tradition, it's like what's our right use of language, you know, to do the least amount of harm. You know, so for me, I always like think, how do I live, you know, I love that idea of Rilke, how do we live the questions? We must live our questions. And then the next thing about that is like, how do we apply next right action to that? And I agree with what everyone's saying about language. I think what's really problematic for me right now is like the Orwellian uses of language and those kinds of distortions. And, you know, in my work, I try to also deal with the false narratives that of capitalism and all the ways that those narratives are spoon-fed to us, and like trying to dismantle them. And, you know, that's something poetry can do. So thank you all. Those are some interesting.
Liz, I have a question I'm dying to ask you. It was sort of hard to formulate. Your new book is so wonderful, witty, entertaining, and erotic. And so I'm wondering, Eros, what would you say the relationship between Eros and social justice is? And how exactly do you imagine it? And does it have anything to do with perfume?
Well, you know, perfume helps us to enact all our senses, right? Smells And perfume is all through the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, lots of different faith traditions. You know, like I was reading this one book that talked about how the burning of foreskins when they first started doing circumcisions was supposed to be a perfume sent up to God. And I just thought that was like the craziest ass thing I'd ever heard in my life. So, but like the erotic is part of the creative impulse, which we also feel in writing a poem sometimes. It's physicality. It's, you know, what our body needs to feel safe or reproduce, right? That idea of also want. And I like what Natalie was saying about want and need. You know, what is, they should be the same thing, because, you know, the strange language of capitalism can get us wanting things that we don't need. And that's the kind of language that it's hard to sort of set, like, to bolster ourselves from, right?
Mhm.
And protect ourselves and protect others as well. You know, because language can be used as to re-traumatize people. I mean,
Mhm.
that's what's happening now. A lot of people are just re-traumatized, and like if you can manipulate the language, you can re-traumatize people. And I think also going back to what Natalie was saying about the oral tradition, you know, one poem that's meant a lot to me in my life is like the Scots Ballad, the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, where it's like it's an instruction on, you know, how to view the political world, like, and what is your moral duty to your country's leader. Like if you are Sir Patrick Spens and you know it's death for you and your whole ship to go out to sea, even though the king tells you you do it, you know. So I think the oral tradition also in different cultures is a way to preserve narratives that are true in any time. That we can return to when language is manipulated in ways to try to get us to go against our own next right action, next empathetic action.
Mhm.
I want to pivot from that and move towards this question of language and how we can learn through language to talk to each other and to listen deeply to each other and to envision a future of equality and diversity. I know that's a big one and maybe it's too optimistic, but I welcome answers from all of you. And then maybe we can then, after that, there's a few interesting questions in the chat from our audience that it would be great to address.
That is a big question. I was thinking about those men, white men in Michigan, and the rage that I felt by a certain kind of narrowness of the human community and their perceived inevitable right to act violently. I always go back to poems, and one of the poems I went to was Robert Hayden's Night, Death in Mississippi, a poem written in the voice of someone who, older white man who celebrates the lynching that he hears off in the distance. That poem, despite a language that may sound on the surface dated, carries so much prophecy about where we are today. And the same violence and the threat of violence that is portrayed in that poem is what we're facing today or could potentially face. I'm happy that poem is there. I'm happy that it gives a portrait of who we are as a country and as a nation. I'm also happy that there's poems that call attention to the climate crisis that we're living in. The poems of police brutality. We need these poems. We come from a rich, rich legacy of protests. And I've said it in the past, I don't think we celebrate it enough. And maybe it's because there's a view that it's not art, that it doesn't take us to some universal transcendent truth. These poems, or at least when Hayden wrote that poem, it was written for that particular moment. I don't use transcendence of time as a measure anymore to determine whether or not a poem is good or effective. It is, and this is part of the argument of some of what I'm making in my newest book, it's a poetry for the now. And isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? So to your question, I believe we need to listen. We really need to listen and listen radically to what poems have to offer as we deal with whatever issues that are meaningful in our lives and that we want to help affect and transform the world. I'm not sure, as Carolyn says, people want to go deep. There's something soothing about getting one's news in a scroll and that being it, and maybe bringing it up at a dinner party or in conversation. But I'm not sure if we are creating and conditioning. I know people are angry. I know people feel enormous rage, feel debilitated, and poetry is there for them. But I'm not sure if we are holding up the great legacy that we have created in protesting, which is, as you know, considered anti-American. That's a travesty of our own lack of vision of art. I'm done, sorry.
Thank you, Major. That was a great answer.
In terms of listening, Major, I want to say that right now, I think the listening needs to happen in the presence of the surviving descendants of the occulted memory of the founding genocide, and also the surviving descendants of enslavement of African peoples. I think in this moment, a lot of things are coming to the surface, and the anger has to do with fighting certain realizations about what this place is and how it was built and on top of whom and who we are. And since that's in the open, we see the agon, we see the struggle now in between those forces. So I find myself reading, voices from those surviving descendant generations, voices that have been not attended to, not listened to, repressed, suppressed voices. So I think a lot of the poetry, the most exciting poetry right now that's being written, it comes from those communities. And so those are the necessary voices to listen to.
I'm gonna say something maybe slightly contrary or elliptical, which is just that I feel that often, and I don't think anybody here has said this, but I feel that often when this question is asked, the question about how is it that language might help us arrive at something like equality, the presumption is that one of the things that poetry does, or one of the things that writing does, is that it might create something like a universal language, a universal human language. I think that in the very beginning, somebody brought up Adrienne Rich, dream of a common language. And for whatever reason, I feel like lately I've been reaching toward that one little pithy quote Glissant's Poetics of Relation, where he says something along the lines of to like feel in solidarity with you, or to build with you, or to like what you do. It's not necessary for me to grasp you. And so I guess maybe this is like a question that I have, right? Is a question about whether or not the frame of this question presumes that in order to like what we each other do, build with each other, feel, right? And I think that the word feel is important here, rather than think or listen or whatever. To feel in solidarity with each other, we have to give up what Glissant calls the right to opacity, right? Is it that it's actually the case that, like, in order to feel and move in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, with Black peoples, that what one has to do is understand them? I'm not sure about that.
No.
I think too, like, I mean, also, I mean, I don't believe in empathy. I know it's a structure of language, and I know it's one that people enact and can utilize. So there are probably, there are words that I use that other people don't use to practice their lives. And that feels really important, Cameron, to bring up. And this, I think, is very rooted in knowledge, and like what we have deemed to be knowledge, and what we have, so what is knowledge is now valuable. It's often able to be extracted. So I'm thinking of, like, for example, with Indigenous peoples, it was knowledge if ethnographers could extract it and take it without the people. So often knowledge is taken from the persons that it belongs to, if it can have a currency outside. But it also affects how things are disseminated. And this is one of the reasons why I believe in poetry, because I feel like poetry subverts the typical methods of dissemination. It doesn't mean I don't participate in the very typical methods of dissemination, being Twitter, being the published book, being the readings, being this structure here now. And it of course, it doesn't mean that I also don't see the value of all of these momentums. Like, but that's something that feels like really important, and it feels very rooted to this idea of understanding. My partner and I talk about this a lot. So we are two queer women, and I am Indigenous and Latina, and she is Black. And we don't understand each other very often. And yet here we are. And, yes, there are the domestic things, but there are experiences I can never understand of hers, that she will never understand of mine. And somehow we live a life. And so I was in this conversation recently, and this reminds me very much of poetry, because I think it has to do with language, and I think it has to do with the communities we build of language and how we pass on what our particular knowledges are. But one of the main, I think, words that needs to be pressed on when we're thinking about poetry is freedom. And what that even means, like what it means to me as an Indigenous person, is very different, I would imagine, than what it means to each of you. And so thinking about that, like, what is freedom? And then what are the languages we use to carry ourselves toward those ideas or within those ideas? And especially when we're thinking about language and the ways we utilize language, because it's very utilitarian, right? I write it, I mean, I'm sitting here with the pencil, like taking down things you've said. And so thinking about this, at least utilitarian mode of language and how we interact with it, but those are things that I think are really important when we're talking about justice, social justice, like any of the ways these things are categorized after we experiencing them in their initial moments. And so again, there's not a real question, but it's again a kind of a gratitude for some of these pressures and fissures, because these fissures, again, I do believe is where a lot of poetry exists, in the neither, in the never, in the always, almost. And so anyway, that's just Cameron and all of these things are kind of moving toward this momentum for me. And that's just one of the places I'm meeting you all there.
Natalie, could you talk then a little bit about silence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also, right, like that's also something, was it Major, you're the one who first mentioned listening, and then Carolyn, you followed up with that. And I think in some ways we're all talking about listening, which is nothing if you're not being attentive or intentional, right? And like, I can hear a bunch of stuff. And so, also not being like just kind of ableist in terms of what is what is silence really? You know, it's not an absence of sound, but it's not without its energy and frictions, you know, and the different sensualities with which we experience silence. But I know that we're in a paradox of silence right now. The silence of touch, for example, the silence of not being around our communities, of mobility, certain mobilities. However, like, we're all so uncomfortable in it to sit. I mean, I'm actually surprised. Like, I know that this is an unprecedented time in my lifetime, and my parents and ancestors have experienced certain things that they might connect to this very differently. But what does it mean that I can't go 6 months of sitting with my thoughts and my incapabilities and my failures? And I mean, this is maybe I don't mean this to be an ungenerous question, and I think I just don't have the language of how to ask it yet, because I think it's not been enough time for me to use whatever language faculties I have for it. But I think this is why, like, we've all come to Twitter, and like, I keep asking myself, like, I probably need more of this time for me to even begin to pick away or chisel away at what it means for me not to always fill up a space or to be the center of a space. Like, can I really listen or hear or be sensual, at least in that, like, receiving? I guess receiving is maybe a better word. Can I be more receiving without having to make it known that I have received? Maybe is one of the ways, Chard, I'm thinking about, and I'm failing at it at times. I feel like I'm getting better at thinking about it, and yet here I am in the middle of all of you, like, running my mouth. So I don't know if that's
You're filling the silence with memorable language.
Yeah. I want to just, we're supposed to finish up, but if people have a little more time, we have some really interesting questions in the chat, and I'm just gonna throw one out there that spoke to me. It's by a wonderful poet who's with us, Franny Choi. Hi, Franny. She says, "Hi, everyone. Thank you for this beautiful conversation. Would you all be willing to name a particular aspect of craft that you've been wrestling with recently in your work in relation to some of these questions? Action, inaction, radical subtlety, animate language, or anything else." So maybe quickly, if there's some craft, poetic craft aspect that you could share.
Oh.
It hasn't been, it's not a conscious wrestling, but I think always I'm trying to think about spatiality, funny enough, in relationship to silence and what gets spoken and doesn't, and what is implied in spaces where the text is not present. I have never been someone who was adventurous typographically on the page, and have been thinking about that a little bit more, trying to be intentional beyond the kind of square blocks, and do something different in that regard. But it's not something that I'm actively pursuing as a form of apprenticeship to the craft, but something that I've been consciously and subconsciously kind of thinking about. What could I do differently in relationship, of course, to the subject and theme of the poem.
If anyone else wants to weigh in on craft, go ahead. But one other question that rose to the top is, what are the greatest challenges facing the witness? I believe this is for you, Carolyn.
I don't regard witness as an identity, so it's not a person, it's a movement, and in other words, poetry of witness is a mode of reading work that has been marked by extremity, rather than a way to write something or or an identity to embody. So I think what's very difficult right now for most people, and I know I share this, is I'm unable to write at the moment. And I think it has to do with the radical transformation of daily life because of the pandemic, and also because of the radical exposure of the rifts in our country, in our society right now, building toward this collective decision that has to be made in the coming weeks. So for me, I just make little notes and phrases and words, and I'm not sure what will emerge from this period of time in my own work, whether in prose or in poetry, because I'm finding myself holding still and watching it and trying to feel what it is. My life has been completely transformed. You know, I was always on the road and always traveling, and I've been in one house now for 230 some days, which is an amazing experience, really. So I'm just waiting. And I don't think, I do want to say really carefully that you have witnesses in courtrooms, but in poetry, it's the language itself, not the person.
Hold on.
Thank you. I think we actually need to wrap up, unless there's a bunch of questions on the chat. Oh gosh, there's one more from another poet, who Amy Dryansky, a wonderful poet from Western Massachusetts. She says, and maybe this will be our last one: along with rage, which is so necessary, can you speak to joy, Eros, pleasure as an act of resistance? If you think about that at all, and if so, how is it present in your work or your intentions around your work?
Yeah, it's like it's taking the erotic back from the oppressor, in particular the male oppressor. You know, like that. In that essay, the uses of the erotic. It's a great question.
Liz, could I also just follow up on that real quickly? Many of your poems are hilarious. Could you talk a little bit about humor in relation to Eros?
I can try. I mean, coming from a family with different traditions, one thing I learned from my father was that Jewish idea of, if you keep them laughing, they can't kill you, you know? I think Mel Brooks said that, you know? And the idea of humor in Jewish literature, and then, but also the erotic that comes from texts like the Song of Solomon. But one of the people in the audience was asking, you know, about that Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic, and I just thought that was such a really good piece of essay and scholarly work to talk about how the erotic can be made to be unseemly by the patriarchy, and how to take the erotic back and put it in a female voice. So, but how to connect the erotic and the funny? Well, I was like, I'm really bad at flirting. I'm always like in awe of some people's flirtation skills. And I think that maybe makes me not as good of a poet. Like if I knew how to flirt better, I might be a better poet. But, you know, like, I think that's where like humor and the erotic can come together, is in the speech act of flirtation. But it's a good question. I'll have to think about it some more.
Okay.
I think that's a great question, Amy. And I'm gonna respectfully ask us as readers to not think in binary ways about rage. I think there's certain poets who have modeled for me that place where the erotic meets their anger, and also their humor. And at times that can be a risky path to follow, but the pleasure in living in one's emotions, wherever that may reside, and writing from that space has been really, I think, part of the lesson of my journey as a writer. So yeah, I don't want to put them in opposition to one another. Clearly there's joy and pleasure, but lately I've been thinking about the entanglement, how it even switches back pretty quickly in a poem and gives it body and dimension.
Well, that's a great place to end. And actually, I'm just gonna read what Natalie just wrote to us, that Eros is also desire. It's a wish for something. And that energy or momentum of desire, incredibly powerful. So thank you all so much for being with us. And this has been recorded, so it'll be places. So
Whoops.
Hey, Diana, are you hearing us? You froze there for a minute. Well, I'm going to step in here and just thank everybody, myself also, and I hope that you will tell people about this this wonderful discussion, and since it is recorded, and I just can't thank you enough for your participation. This has really been a memorable hour and a half.
thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Parcel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.